Welcome back to the Craniotomy podcast. This is our episode. Muhammad is out today, so we'll have to talk about the weather since he always likes to talk about how, he's suspiciously absent. So Muhammad is in Tucson, and he's always talking about how the weather's so much better there. But I think this month, finally, it's 80s and 90s in Minneapolis, and it's a good 100 and whatever 10 or 120 in Tucson. So I think we finally beat him out, but he's not here during that time, so we can't even talk about it. But today we have Dr. Grissom here, another esteemed faculty member at the University of Minnesota, here to talk more about her expertise and what she's passionate about. And of course we always have Dr. Herman and myself. We should explain that as a side note, this podcast, most people listen to it as just a podcast, but some people can watch it on video. So that's why it's complicated. Just to let you know. I will let Dr. Grissom introduce herself and ask and shout the grueling question.
Hi. I love grueling questions. My name is Nicola Grissom. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Minnesota. Psychology? ? And I have an interest in lots of factors, ultimately stemming towards what makes some of us more likely to be diagnosed with a neuropsychiatric condition than others. That can branch off in a lot of different directions, and there's a lot of assumptions and thoughts to unpack in that kind of statement. But that's what got me started. So I'll start there.
When did you first start thinking about those kinds of questions, do you think? Or when do you remember first starting to think about it?
Well, people don't often ask this, and it's sort of, not really. And you're supposed to say like, oh, in graduate school or blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But the true answer, I think, really is that not many people know this, but my mother is pretty severely bipolar. And although I am far from perfect, that's not one of the problems that I have going on. And yet we know, among other things, that diagnoses like that can be relatively hereditary. That a lot of diagnoses that we're aware of that people are concerned by or that trouble people, like addictions or depression, a lot of these things can be passed along in families. And the mechanisms of why sometimes that doesn't happen kind of got me started along the path. And I've always sort of been interested in the individual differences that can emerge to create different kinds of vulnerabilities, maybe in different kinds of people, or the way that the same vulnerability might express itself as different kinds of diagnoses, just because of other, luck of the draw, environmental factors, and who happens to be diagnosing you. So that's what got me started. But I took a lot of different circuitous pathways there. I did stress research for a while in graduate school. For a while, I did my PhD in stress neurobiology. And then in postdoc, I got interested initially in genetic and epigenetic mechanisms. But in order to study that, I got really good at studying teaching mice video games for milkshakes, basically, to study their cognition. And it turns out that there's a whole host of gene variant questions and other kinds of questions that you can ask once you know how to ask mice to do what are pretty tricky cognitive problems for a mouse. So, but along the way, those interests have sort of led me to think more critically, potentially more deeply. I'll leave that for others to judge, about how we think about diagnosis and like what is a diagnosis, is a diagnosis the same thing as an illness? And what about all these factors that we think of as contributing to risk? Are they actually just contributing to important individual difference?
Mm-hmm. Oh, fascinating. There's so much there to talk about. You just provided us with material for the entire conversation. Thank you.
I am to please.
Like, definitely a lot to come back to, but what really stuck in my mind was my reaction that lens on heritability, to me at least, is very unique. I'm not sure I've ever thought about the opposite side of heritability, which is why do some people not, why don't these conditions express in some people, and what could that potentially tell us? It's the opposite to the way I'm used to thinking about it, which is in terms of like, what does the expression of the illness tell us about potential mechanisms, right?
Right.
So how do you think about asking questions along those lines of what does, or if that's even a part of your research program, I guess, what does the lack or decreased heritability or decreased expression of a heritable illness tell us about mechanism, or about, potential treatments or whatnot?
Yeah. So I remember being at a conference. It was ACNP, I think. It may have even been the first one I went to. So 2011, something like that. Where there was a talk about the idea that it was about bipolar. So this was not my primary research interest, but it happened to be about bipolar. I was like, oh, I have a passing curiosity there. Where the central finding of the presentation was that people who are related to those with bipolar, and potentially children of people with bipolar, are more likely to have migraines. And I was like, well, that's something I extremely do have, are migraines very frequently. I just had one yesterday, actually. That's over now, thank goodness. And I deal with it. It's fine. It's a thing that happens to me, and but at the same time, that's another thing that doesn't happen to everybody. But it kind of got me thinking, is it that sort of sets up this question, is the whatever molecular mechanism or mechanisms that you could imagine might have manifested in one particular way, in the way that my mom happened to have developed, might have worked a little bit differently when my brain was developing, and sort of set me up for sort of different vulnerability. And that's, it's something definitely possible, but migraine is still a problem, that's a framing there. So migraine is, certainly I would love to not have them anymore. But what if that same vulnerability, that same molecular difference, also is part of what makes me, a better mentor? Maybe that's up for my trainees to decide, but maybe contributes to my creativity, or such as it is, or the way that I like to approach problems. And so, would I be willing to get rid of those things to get rid of a migraine? And that's not a completely facetious question, because I've tried a couple times to pyramate Topamax for my migraines. And one thing that definitely does, I don't know if it'll ever help my migraines, because I've never been able to be on it for more than a week, because the most obvious side effect that it has is just making me very dull. Not particularly, I can't really lecture, I can't talk on the fly, I couldn't do this. And so I had to make a choice. I was like, clearly it's not worth giving that up in order to get rid of my migraines for that medication. But I think that is potentially illustrative of a broader push and pull that I think we all know is there. We sort of treat as maybe a Goldilocks problem, that there's some just right amount of brainness, whatever mechanism we think about, that there's some Goldilocks way for the brain to be, that leads to, and that if you are pushing it too far, then you can lead into all sorts of diagnostic categories. But there's a caveat there, which is we probably don't know what the Goldilocks range is, and it may be quite a bit wider than we suspect. And we might, there might be other things that would get thrown out with some babies that might get thrown out with the bathwater. So that reasoning I see also at play a lot and is very pertinent to me in the two sort of main research interests that my lab has, which are sex differences and neurodevelopmental and particularly autism-associated gene variants, because I don't think anybody would be comfortable arguing, I would hope, that to whatever extent there are molecular mechanisms of sex that might influence the brain, that we should get rid of one of those, or that one of those is better than the other. Far from it. But the implication might also be there for like gene variants that are associated with an autism diagnosis. Not always, but would we want to understand how those are changing the brain, rather than like assuming that whatever they're doing to the brain must be bad because it may lead to other under-recognized benefits. And in fact, in sort of the decision-making area, that's one of the ways that we can see unique and intriguing and potentially, depending on your perspective or the situation, beneficial influences of being autistic.
Can you say a little bit more about? Yeah, go ahead, David. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, can you say a little bit more about that last point? Because I think that would be really interesting to people.
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons I got really excited about decision making, is because it's one of the better replicated ways. When I was starting the lab, I got interested in decision making. It's one of the better replicated ways that people in the autism spectrum can differ from neurotypical people in a sort of parametric way. And like all clinical literature, there's a lot of variability even there, and individual variability, but using a particular kind of a decision-making task that, you guys are familiar with, this sort of gambling task, bandit tasks. Autistic people can actually, under certain circumstances, do either they can perform essentially more or less the same as neurotypical people, but there have been demonstrations of certain reward ratios or ways that you can set up the task where autistic people can sometimes outperform, get more rewards, do better than neurotypical people. And so it was really exciting to me, and this was 2016, and it was exciting to me as an animal researcher because from the animal research side, most of what has been published about animals with genotypes associated with neurodevelopmental diagnoses is deficit model, right? Is they did this bad and this bad and this bad, and this is all the things that are weird with this mouse. And so all those things that they did, that were not like the typical mouse, are the problems that we need to solve. And that has two sort of circularities in it. One is, how do you know that those particular behaviors have actually anything to do with the diagnosis that you're purporting to address, which is just an unaddressed one or based on face validity. Like, this is a social behavior and these mice are interacting, therefore that's somehow going to solve it. And the sort of second circularity was that they were always bad at it, right? Like, it was like always something that they were bad at. And like, it's like no, autistic people are not bad at everything. It's a disability, but it changes how they interact with the world. And there can be things that are, the same as neurotypical people. There can be things that would be different. And so I was excited about this as a potential way to try to explore how the brain can be impacted by mechanisms of individual difference, not in a framing of there's a right way to solve this task, there's a right way to do this, and more from a framing of this is some of the hardest stuff that we do. Figuring out what the right thing is to do in an ambiguous situation, which is what gambling is some of the hardest stuff that our brain works on. And there should be a variety of solutions across different individuals to solve those kinds of problems. We need them from like an evolutionary standpoint. And so maybe that it begins to paint a picture of why sometimes things might go a little bit extreme, but it doesn't necessarily follow that those extreme versions might not be born of really important different individual differences in cognition that we can't afford to lose. And this is sort of like continuing evolving interest of mine, I guess I will say. But as a philosophy for orienting the lab, it's pretty persistent. Like I am, as a mouse researcher, this is how I was trained. There's only so much I can do, but when orienting to work with, clinicians or people who work with humans, this is obviously something that I am, looking for, is openness to making sure that we're interpreting the data, not necessarily purely from a deficit model, but from a sort of psychosocial model that could incorporate, how can this be, what are the situations in which this could be better accommodated? What are the situations that this could be something that we want to sort of recognize and potentially and appreciate? Which is getting a little bit vague, but bring it back down to like, what can we do with a mouse? We can actually use it to, demonstrate different mechanisms that might contribute to individual variance, diversity in how we think or how they think, how decision making happens. And, with the goal of playing with the parameters of these decision-making tasks that we can have the mice do to sort of show what the hypothesis is, or to demonstrate empirically what I'm asking you guys to think about theoretically, which is that there are definitely situations where a given strategy would be really successful and a different situation where that same strategy would be really unsuccessful. And so if you are biased a little bit towards solving problems this way, you're going to have some situations you thrive and some where you less thrive. And that we should be mindful. We should be on the lookout for those kinds of parameters, those kinds of tasks that can allow us to do that, and thinking about whether in a preclinical or a clinical setting, or basic research setting, like embracing the spectrum of possibilities of how to solve a problem, instead of assuming that we know the one correct way to do it. Which animal researchers love to have one correct way to do things because it makes our lives simpler, but the mice don't know what the hell we want them to do in there. They just get thrown into a strange situation. They have no clue. They're like in the box. They get they get like a little droplet of milkshake sometimes, and it's up to them to piece together how that happened, what they think is most likely to have caused that, it brings the humility out in us all if we can appreciate that the mice aren't necessarily going to make the same assumptions we do, but we can use that to ask, well, what assumptions do you make? How do you think the world works? Anyway, it's very tangential all over the place, but
no, I think it's right on point. And there's like so many layers to it. I think that's the problem. I'm having a problem holding all of these layers in my head at the same time. But I think the first layer, I think in many ways humans are quite similar to mice in that regard, in that especially humans that have the diseases that we're talking about, neuropsychiatric diseases, they're, in my experience, they're often trying to figure out how to, put themselves in the state that they appreciate being in.
Yeah.
Not without really having a guidance, And so I think from that perspective, it's really interesting, which leads to sort of the second layer, which is why I like decision making so much, because the tasks to be made up are just infinite, and while we do have to, there's a finite amount of time, there's some practical measures. The tasks that you're specifically talking about is really great because it is very open-ended in a weird way, but it's very open-ended. And I think, if as clinicians and scientists, if we're only looking for people to do a task that's really simple, and we're only looking at the reflections of disease upon the world as these negative things, then we are missing the diversity of which may very well help to address many of the problems that we have around the world that are not typically solved by approaches where you just sort of churn.
Yeah.
The biggest problems are not solved by doing I don't know, a word task or whatever. They're just not. A lot of people, a lot of things, they can do those sort of tasks, but the big questions in the world, the hard things in the world, the hard things that we go through, in life, they bear little resemblance to the sort of classical paradigms that, have been tested. So I really like sort of this lens because it's much more focused on variation from that positive perspective.
Yeah. And at the same time, we have to work in a lab setting, right? So we have to pare things down to their bare bones as much as we can so that we don't overload ourselves with variables. But still, this like these gambling tasks, these decision-making tasks, I think get it down to the bone, right? There's still a ton of room for variation, but cleanly enough that we can actually demonstrate some of the things that we assume to be true, we intuit to be true, but then we can actually show them with some fancy math and some collaborative help that yeah, in fact, there are multiple ways to solve this problem, and that some of them are going to be more successful in certain circumstances than others, but that each one of them is potentially valuable. Instead of just sort of saying that we know that that's true, but it's nice to be able to demonstrate it concretely. You know what I mean? I was talking to somebody recently, and somebody new, a new faculty to the university, I think, and they were like, oh, what do you work on? What is your lab about? And I mentioned, that we work on, we think about sex differences and neurodevelopmental conditions, and we got a little bit into this, and the upshot was they're like, oh, you just kind of do a minefield research, all these things that are minefields. I was like, yes. Sometimes I wish it were more straightforward, but on the other hand, someone's going to do it. And I would like to at least have put myself in the position of being able to run interference, basically, to do that research as sensitively and mindfully of the importance of individual difference and diversity and valuing all these factors that make people or mice different. Because there are a lot of persistent sort of, there are lay questions about, why are boys more diagnosed with autism than girls, to the very highest levels of the field. There are funding mechanisms designed around that question. And if there's funding mechanisms around that, then it behooves me to try to get in as much as possible to say if we're going to spend, effort and money addressing these questions, then we should do so from the principle that we're not going to discover like what's wrong with boys, you know, like, or why is something bad in one situation and good in another, as opposed to like, what are the situations in which all of these things can be important and useful so that we can like value them appropriately when we're making ultimately clinical decisions about how to address what are actually problems. And it's worth also saying that the other thing that's cool about decision making is that if you talk to autistic people, or you read what they have to say on Twitter, because they have opinions about what's going on. It's not hard to find. They are kind of irritated with like mouse work focusing on social behavior, which I share that irritation. But they do have real problems. You know, it is a disability. And what are the things that they actually struggle with? They self-report struggling, you know, with motivation and with intuiting, you know, the best situation, the honest communication from, you know, more sarcastic or flirty communication, for example, you know, like how to interpret that kind of information. With executive function and planning issues, you know, and especially in the face of sort of changing environments. And, you know, like, how do I manage like my life when like things are changing and it's very stressful, or something is different? If something is unexplained or an unplanned difference that I have to try to negotiate around. And these are emblematic ultimately of some of the hardest stuff that we do. How do we navigate a flexible, changing world? How do we determine what kind of situation we're in and change our behavior accordingly in order to get the best possible outcome? Involves knowing what the best possible outcome might be. How do we learn the situations that might change what the best possible outcome is going to be? So it really like gets back at this sort of bare bones thing. And these are the things that the bare bones thing being sort of decision making, but these are the things that people themselves are reporting are like, these are the things, like also anxiety, which again, you know, would heavily stem from not being able to predict what the hell is going on in their world. These are the things that they would like help with. And so at the very least, I feel like it behooves me as an animal researcher to try to focus on those things as much as I can, you know? Yeah, we'll see. We'll see if I do any of it successfully, but that is at least the part of a motivating factor that I bring up a lot in my talks. Like, it's not a mystery. They're tweets. You can see them. Like, here are things that there are conversations between autistic people within themselves being like, here's something that irritates me about neurotypical people and what they assume about us. And here's what's actually true. It's all basic researchers in particular, I think they read the DSM definition, or not even that. They just saw that it's social behavior and repetitive behavior and sort of stopped there. Makes me nuts. Anyway.
Well, I think one, you know, so it makes me think a lot about one of these tenets that we have in our lab, which is to look at these in as much of a transdiagnostic way as possible, because basically 4 of the things you listed there are essentially the complaints that I hear in my clinic, and probably the same complaints that Alex hears in his clinic, and we hear from other, you know, in other diseases. Like, it's the same. There's a lot of overlap from, you know, these a sort of patient-centered approach in terms of what people they want prioritized for research. And you know, from our perspective, the bare bones decision making is essentially the answer to that. It's, you know, like, why can't we learn from each other by looking at the variation and not just saying like, you know, oh, this is, you know, autism or this is depression, but like, you know, this is the sort of appropriate dimensionality reduction. And yes, we understand how people have been diagnosed, and we understand that there are different etiologies, and getting at the pathophysiology from that perspective so that we can say, look, this is you, and this is you as much as we know, not just from your, autistic colleagues or, cohort versus the healthy controls. This is you in a lens that, this is what we've learned from the whole world, and this is sort of what we're trying to, bring into the clinical world. And that's, for us, a topic of conversation that's like weekly, in the lab, is the struggle to do that, because, that's one of the things that funding mechanisms and funding agencies don't really like, and it's not that they don't like it openly, but that it ends up being something that, you don't really get to talk about.
Well, people like to think that they have some baseline understanding of something, of anything, right? Like funders want to know that they have some baseline understanding of what this diagnosis is, and RDoC, these trans diagnostic initiatives were so, I think, well intentioned. Although they still ultimately had to go for okay, well, here's the thing that what it is instead is this construct, like this cognitive construct of executive function, or I can't even remember what they are right now, but it's not even clear, or impulsivity. Like impulsivity is a really good one to pick on, because the only thing we're sure of now is that we don't know what it means, and it means a bunch of different things. Some of those things might not exist. So, cool. So in light of the fact that cognitive constructs are, I think more in our grasp, but at the same time not diagnosable. They just are constructs that you can sort of think about. That then it just sort of all defaulted back to like diagnostic categories, because it's like, okay, here's a bin that we can chuck diagnoses into, and we can call it all the same thing, and then we can say that we're studying that thing that all of these individual cases got chucked into. But we all know that it can't work that way. It doesn't, right? So it has to be transdiagnostic. It has to be about like how you compare to the world, and I would argue how you compare to yourself. Like that's something that I know that Alex and I have talked about, and that, and like in the thinking about like anxiety and depression, but also most diagnoses, most conditions that people deal with you have ups and downs, like, and we don't really think about that either. Like it's sort of like you have this diagnosis and you are always this way, but as human beings, we know that is not the case, that sometimes you have, relatively manageable times, and sometimes you have less so. And when I was doing stress research as a graduate student, that was sort of how we subsumed that. We're like, well, some times are stressful, and that those stressful times are, going to change how the brain is functioning, and set us up for having a harder time of it, which is true. But there's very little, like, because it would be a huge amount of work, but there's very little like stress. There's some stress by depression, in people, for example, or stress by a variety of disorders that we know are sort of characterized by relapse. So like addiction, but also like psychosis, for example. But it's I think that kind of factor, those ups and downs factors, which may or may not be directly related to some overt stressor that you can point to, as opposed to like a variety of things that might be going on in a person's life or in the world. But I would love to know how individual, like, sort of what is the range of possible behaviors an individual would show, and like how can you tell when maybe they're about to enter a period of time that they would perceive as particularly challenging and upsetting, and how at that point to be able to say, okay, like now it is time to intervene, whether that be cognitive behaviorally or therapeutically, talk therapy, pharmacologically, some combination, whatever it has to be, deep brain stimulation parameters need to change, but that is how you would sort of be able to online track and say like, okay, now, in the way that we can know when somebody's sleep patterns begin to be disrupted, that something's going wrong. Well, there's probably other clues in the way that they are, choosing to navigate the world, that if we could detect those, if we could get a full picture of what people are thinking, then we might be able to detect those times when they're struggling for whatever reason they're struggling. And on top of whatever diagnosis they might have that would, make them have a general set point of deciding things one way or another, of navigating a world one way or another. Anyway, that's the dream, I think, long term, right?
Yeah. I don't know. That to me is like a tremendously beautiful segue into talking about, cognitive flexibility or cognitive rigidity or, motivation from the point of view as not, we always tend to look at it as like the outcome. But, I think we wonder, and we're trying very hard to figure out how that plays into itself.
Yeah.
Are these are things that we can measure, because in some sense they're the bare bones of what a lot of this, what a lot of what we talked about today, what that means. But is it also part of the same pattern or part of the idiopathology of or reverberation of some of these clinical manifestations of disease? Can you get into patterns of cognition that are, self-defeating, for example? And that's a lot of what we're trying. And you're talking about having a readout so you can intervene, from these. And I think that is absolutely where we're trying to be right now. But I think the $1 million question, or I don't know, that's not a lot of money anymore, I guess. But the $1 billion question is, in some sense, is it possible to look at circuit level function or a transdiagnostic view in a way that identifies patterns that are self-defeating?
I guess it depends whether or not a self-defeating pattern is the same for everybody or not. Like transdiagnostic, to the extent that that not all people are one size fits all, or diagnoses don't all fit in the same bucket, is important. But I do think that the diagnoses at best reflect some central tendency, maybe, like there's some thing where more often than not, this person might be likely to veer in this potential direction. Like, I guess a person who's struggling with depression, who goes in to get ketamine, and that is maybe beneficial for them. It's working really well for them, which is really good. Their sort of problem direction is probably different on a circuit, on a neuronal level, than a person who is prodromic for a psychotic episode, for which I think we can reasonably be confident that ketamine would probably be not great for that person. It would probably provoke that episode that might be about to happen. I think that sort of presents the hardest challenge, or a hard challenge, for a truly fully transdiagnostic point of view, in that also I've presented as though depression and schizophrenia never overlap, when they totally do. But for the cartoon example, basically, like, at what point is it that there are really two circuit level things going on? To what extent could we pull out those two circuit level things by looking at their behavior? Because that's one where we have something that would be really effective in one case, or at least have a strong probability of being effective in one case, and be really not a good idea in this other person's case. And yet you want to be able to help that person because maybe you can see that something bad is going down. Maybe they've just experienced a big stressor, but how is that stressor going to play out for them depends on some sort of underlying baseline that they have, some diathesis, to use the really old word, but like, yeah, so I struggle with that because at some point I want to be super transdiagnostic because you're right, what you were saying earlier, like these are the challenges for everybody, like motivation, executive function, planning, anxiety. Like these are, I think, the things that probably most people are struggling with for one reason or another, but are they struggling with it for the same reasons? Are the reasons that somebody who is autistic struggling with motivation, are the same motivational challenges that are existing for a neurotypical in that particular axis, but maybe depressed person,
Right.
And I truly don't know the answer to that. That's unexplored territory as far as I know. No pressure.
Yeah. I think from, what a lot about this is the mixture between circuit level dynamics of the brain and the enormous degree of freedom that we have as a person, right? And these two things are reality. I mean, you can try all day, but there's so much going on that it's not reducible in a very real way. But at the same time, the sort of approach that you're talking about, and I think that we have in mind as well, where you are keeping in mind these, sort of very basic labels from the clinical world, but somewhat ignoring them in a way that you can compare across these labels, across people in general, with the long-term goal of very systematic approach towards offering treatments that are super specific to them. So like, yes, there's a lot of possibilities and, but I guess I don't know a better way than, paying excruciating attention to each individual patient, like you're sort of proposing, and simultaneously trying to relate that in a fundamental way to these core tenets of, circuit theory about the brain or systems neuroscience or decision making in a very specific sense. But excruciating detail is really the only, at a large scale, is really the only way that I've encountered that we might be able to actually tackle that problem. We can analyze therapy in sort of a real-time sense.
Well, that just made me wonder, though, and this comes from a real naive perspective about these kinds of trials, but I've always wondered about the placebo effect in antidepressants, how the placebos seem to be more and more effective. If that was just because the people enrolled in the placebo arm were finally getting some attention,
Right.
We're finally getting some, like that kind of intense focus, like you're talking about, and maybe not as intense as they still needed, but more than was happening for them before, and that they had some hope for potentially a change because it was a placebo, because somebody's paying attention, and that hope itself can help people,
For sure, and that's so powerful. There's a well-known TMS study that failed in the VA. It was a negative result, but the problem, the result was that the placebo effect was so significant. It was something like 40% placebo. You're never going to see separation with treatment. The placebo effect is that large, and so.
I mean, that was a brain stimulation study?
Yeah, that was a TMS for depression study at the VA. Yeah.
So I mean, like the placebos had to have brain surgery?
No, TMS.
Magnetic. Okay, never mind. I'm tired. What day is it? Monday?
I wanted to ask you a related question, but
okay.
I'm thinking about this project to understand individual differences and the diversity from different dimensions than we thought about them before. And it's fascinating and seems so scientifically important. And then I'm trying to hold that in mind with this collapsed dimensions of suffering, like you mentioned, like difficulty with motivation, anxiety, right? And I'm curious how you think about those as being connected or not, or in other words, other than helping us understand people, do you think of the project of trying to understand individual differences as eventually helping us, come up with more personalized approaches to helping people with complaints along these collapsed dimensions like motivation? Or do you see it more as, or it could be both, they're not mutually exclusive, but enriching our understanding of what it means to be autistic, for instance, or what it means to be a woman or a man or anything like that, by showing us that there are these really important individual differences even within these groups or across groups? Or does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, and it's an interesting question, and an important one. I mean, I want to say yes to all of it, but what I'm less of a cop-out answer is, if you approach, like, just approaching sort of preclinical basic research relevant to neurodevelopmental disorders, there are just some assumptions that people have going in, that I don't think we can crack. I don't think we can break apart those assumptions or think differently about them unless we demonstrate that they are not true, So one such assumption would be, for example, that that a gene variant that is probabilistically associated with autism is likely to, produce problems with cognition, and that those problems with cognition inherently, that those specific problems those specific differences are problems, first of all, universally all the time, and secondly, that alleviating or removing those differences that we are conceiving as problems is leading to some sort of material benefit, rescuing them, basically. That assumption, that's a series of assumptions that we make, and if we don't test them, if we don't say, well, is there a difference in cognition? Is it actually a deficit? First of all, let's test that assumption. And then second of all, and this question is less appropriate to animal research, but it can be supported by animal research. If we do something that changes that, is that actually helping in any domain that people really need help in, or is it helping, or is it causing some sort of, or is it not having any sort of particular effect at all, that in anything that is actually causing anybody stress, or personal trouble? If we want to try to approach the sort of like the shared sources of suffering problem, there's two ways to do it. One is you could just sort of like address the suffering more directly. I could say, like, I'm actually going to become an anxiety researcher now. I'm going to try to understand anxiety, except that in itself is even harder to conceptualize because there's in animal models, because there's no construct of anxiety that is really accessible or approachable. So we're going to have to like work harder to, connect to human researchers and really good translatable decision-making based measures. And there's a different conversation, and maybe one that we can have still, about why I think decision-making has a much higher chance of being translatable across species than most of the other things that people have tried for mood and anxiety and stress related measures. But so I might not do that because it's really hard to measure in animals in a way that we're all confident is something that's going to directly translate to people. And it doesn't necessarily help us understand specific situations that people might be in the anxiety that would be associated with, or the anxiety that is found in people on the autism spectrum, whether or not that's different from or triggered more easily, or caused by different situations than for a person who doesn't have that particular diagnosis. And so I guess I see the research that we're doing here as sort of investigating these individual differences to affirm them, to establish where we can the boundaries between differences and problems, not to say deficit, but like where there are differences, and where in what situations might those actually be leading to things that could be contributing to disability, versus differences that just happen to exist that we shouldn't worry about. And then having, sort of like trying to champion the fact that these differences exist and they can be useful and good potentially, and that we should have them, but then also to say like, okay, but what are the situations in which we can detect that, let's say, stress on top of this, or a particularly challenged individual is having this particular pattern of decision-making behavior, and here, like, that's a space that we can sort of intervene. So I'm kind of getting off the rails from what you were saying, but I think that I'm motivated to help with the domain of suffering. I forget what the term was that you used, but it was compelling. I'm motivated to help with that. But I need to figure out, even for myself, the extent to which what we're looking at, what we can look at in mice is differences, and to the extent to which we might actually sometimes find, like in response to stress, for example, which we're interested in moving into, or in response to being a more or less dominant animal in a cage, or subordinate, that there might be room in there for individual differences in response that are also associated with detrimental life experiences, and that those would be the ones that we would want to be able to measure, figure out the neurobiology of, and potentially those would be the things that we want to target. But we can't tell the difference right now between what is just a difference in decision making and what is a difference in decision making we might actually want to intervene with. I guess that's finally I figured out how to say it succinctly, I guess.
Yeah, that was very nicely put at the end.
Like if I find, because we have found some evidence that male and female mice on average tackle decision-making tasks a little bit differently, I don't think we can conclude that either approach, average approach, is better or worse. They're just different. And it's not like every female is doing the same things every other female, or that every male is doing this. There's quite a bit of individual variation within this like category that we've made up. And so I guess everything I say starts from there, but if I wouldn't feel comfortable saying it about a difference, if I wouldn't feel comfortable saying it as like a sex difference, then I'm not necessarily comfortable saying it as like any sort of like gene variant related difference is detrimental or different. All I can, or detrimental or problematic. All I can say is that this is a difference that exists, and try to find the situations in which that difference matters the most, matters the least. Try to think about situations in which we might actually want to be concerned, but first we have to figure out the situations in which variation decision making is normal. Like if we're going to be measuring human decision making, let's say in this perfect world I outlined earlier, where we're detecting changes in an individual person over time, where we can say, oh, you are veering down a path that's not great for you. We need to know that path is not great for them, but to recognize that it might be part of a good path for somebody else.
Yeah.
which is a lot more work than I think anybody wants to do.
For sure.
But that doesn't make it not true. You know what I mean?
Definitely, yeah.
So no pressure.
Another question I had, and I just really appreciate you being so thoughtful in your responses, is like kind of bringing it back onto a personal level.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure if we could like carve out your migraines and cure them and not change anything else, I would speculate that would be a pretty wonderful thing for you, right? But I wonder a little bit what you think about the situation where like migraines and Nicola are not completely dissociable, right? Mm-hmm. And like, what if there really is some fundamental linkage or trade-off there?
Yeah.
How would you want, what tools would you want us to have to be able to support you going through life being who you want to be? As David said, like being in the space I can't remember how he said it exactly, but that you would want to be in.
If you went to your primary care doctor and said, I heard you on the podcast last, and and you talked about how predictability is such an important thing. There's this new service, and all you got to do is just sign up here and basically, give them all your data and interact with them, and they will tell you with this confidence, like, what the patterns of your life and the patterns of your pain and the patterns of your suffering look like. Is that something that is you think is interesting, or do you think that something that's so invasive that it would make it challenging for you to accept that as sort of reality?
Reaching back to my mom, like, I can imagine that she would like to know when she's about to transition into a depressive episode, if only so that she can try to, stay up as much as possible. But there's a lot of stigma involved in that. And so if we could, I guess in a perfect world, if we could remove the stigma, yes, absolutely. In an imperfect world, if we still have that stigma, then that becomes like a major challenge. And also I would want it to be for me, right? And not because somebody is thinks I'm going to be more productive, write 2 more papers a year and get grants. And like, this is why, like, we've made this app available. I can see it, right? Like, we've made this app available to you because we think that you're going to be able to write, 0.6 more R01s per year. Yikes, right? And yet if it were for me, if it was like, so that you can have like a Saturday where you are, just able to enjoy life instead of like having a headache, then yes. But those are the problems. It's not the data. It's the stigma and what I can do with my small corner of the universe is to try to chip away at stigma, and so that is the ultimate motivation for, by accident of the kind of research that I was able to get involved in that was really exciting. Some of the stigma that I am most in position to be able to chip away at are related to like thinking about sex differences and thinking about neurodevelopmental conditions and disabilities. But I would like that across the board for psychiatric disabilities of all types.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Grissom. It is almost painful to end this because I feel like there was a lot of stuff left unsaid and not talked about, but it was absolutely fascinating.
For sure.
Well, I'm sure we can talk again sometime if you like, and I will have more rambly things to say. But yeah, it's been fun. Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you.